Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Esther Wickham. The state of Wisconsin have been going back and forth when it comes to education and the school system over consolidation efforts with various school districts in different cities. Following this report is Wisconsin reporter John Stife. John, give us a breakdown on what's been happening.
Essentially, Wisconsin schools, just like the overall population, they're losing kids. Every year, it's about 10,000. They're projecting that it's going to be 200,000 less public school students by 2050. So the issue becomes, okay, how do we properly educate these students? And do we have too many school districts? Right now, they have 421 in the state. Um, and in some areas, especially areas near cities where there's overlapping schools, where there's single school districts, there are some things that lawmakers believe make sense that could be combined. And they have put together 5 laws that would essentially help schools like that go through the process of consolidating.
Seeing this kind of play out over time, what are some of the factors that have kind of affected, children's declining in enrollment and just kind of the education system that kind of brought this bill about?
Well, one of the things is that right now there's only one district or 2 districts in the state that are considering consolidating. The last one to happen was 2018. Schools are having funding issues in the state. There was a 10-year freeze on state funding for the schools, and there's always a lot of complaints regarding that. There's a rising number of referendum that local school districts are going through in order to raise more funds because there's levy limits in terms of related to how many students you have. So if you have less students next year than the year before, you can't continue to raise your levy a bunch, because you have less students. So you can't keep charging taxpayers more. A lot of these buildings and infrastructure are getting older, so lawmakers are like, okay, there are difficult decisions that are going to have to be made overall in the state. And one of the bills that's part of this is an overall study for the entire state that says, okay, right now the lines for school districts are arbitrary, the size of school districts are arbitrary. How about we do this complete study and analysis of the entire system and say what actually makes sense in terms of how this is structured?
In your article, you kind of outlined that the state also had consolidation about 7 years ago. Could you talk a little bit about that? And then also, now with this kind of new bill for consolidation, what are some of the pros and cons that could come from it?
Well, they've progressively over time, they have less and less school districts, but that I mean, the big benefit is obviously that you can combine transportation and administration. The biggest issue is combining transportation because, especially when you're talking about smaller rural school districts, some of them that are really struggling for funding as much as anything, it's really hard to have to bring students like an hour in one direction so they can go to a school just because it's combined and it makes more sense financially. I have kids of my own, like you have to get up an hour earlier. Like that's a problem, especially for high schoolers who often go to school pretty early in the day to begin with.
Yeah, and with this consolidation bill, you talked a little bit about it with taxpayer funding and what that funding is going to generally look like. Could you go into that a little bit deeper, looking at the incentives behind this bill for the school districts?
So one of the biggest issues is when you combine 2 school districts and they have different mill rates, they take different amounts from the taxpayers. Combining those operations and still having it be feasible. There have been issues in the past. I believe there was a school consolidation maybe 10 years ago they were citing where it went really poorly financially for the schools. And the lawmakers know that, and they've worked closely with the State Department of Education on the topic. They know that there can be financial difficulties when going through that process. So that's why one of the bills allows for $25,000 to do a single or 2 district study on what consolidation would mean. There's also a $2,000 per student one-time incentive, essentially, if 2 school districts were to combine into one within the next 3 years. And a lot of the discussion with that bill was, well, it's not really feasible for the within the next year to that for that to happen. So really, it's the 2 years after that when it would happen, because this process is such a long process to be able to combine all these operations.
Yeah, and I think based off of that analysis, what's the kind of timeline for this if this was to, start and go forth? Would this happen in, pretty soon, or would take a couple of years? Because I'm assuming they have to, you know, pull funds from different, administrative costs within the education system.
Well, one of the interesting things about the bills is that oftentimes in Wisconsin and in other states, things are very partisan. So the Republicans control the legislature. They push things through despite objection from the Democrats. And then the governor is a Democrat and he can just veto it and then it doesn't happen. Well, in this case, DPI in charge of education in the state has been working with these lawmakers. And while there are some levels of questioning from the Democrats that are on committee, it's also very clearly stated, well, we're not necessarily against this because it's a voluntary process. It's literally just, okay, does the funding exist to do all these programs? Like if a bunch of school districts decide to do this, that's a lot of money. They don't think that it's going to be a lot of school districts that do it. It's like very particular ones that do it. So, what would the timeline be? They would pass this legislation. They're hoping during this session, which so which probably means January or February. Then schools would begin that process. They would have to put out a trying to get the feasibility study done. That I'm sure would take about 6 months. And so we're talking into probably 2027 before the first of the school districts that are already thinking about it would do it. One of the key components of it is working through all the school board associations and the administrator associations in the state, because what some of the lawmakers have said is that, yeah, the state organizations are aware this student population is an issue and they understand the gravity of the entire thing, but not all the school districts necessarily understand the entire picture of what's going on. And so that's going to take a little bit of time in order to make sure that everybody's aware of that and then start these local discussions. And one of the things that's going to help with that is this statewide study when it comes back and says, well, this is an area we should target, like maybe the area between Milwaukee and Chicago, the Racine area in particular, where one of the lawmakers is from. Maybe that's a great place for them to start, because you look at all the single school districts that are in an area like that. They're not that far apart, so transportation wouldn't be as large of an issue.
Well, thanks, John, for breaking this study down. It'll be interesting to see kind of what happens in the future, since this is kind of a partisan issue, and what the arguments are on both sides. For those that are interested in continuing to follow John's story, you can go to thecentersquare.com.